Good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to begin. Thank you all for joining us on this absolutely gorgeous Bethany morning. It is still morning, right? I'm Angie Beto, and I am the president of Bethany College Alumni Council. And on behalf of the entire council, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you and invite you to enjoy our guest today for our 2021 Grimes Lecture Series. In 2014, Alumni Council established an endowed fund to honor the 20 years of service and dedication to the college by former professor of English, Larry Grimes. Some of you, I'm sure, know him well. That same year, Professor Grimes himself delivered the inaugural address on campus, our inaugural lecture. So I wanted to just share that the purpose of our lecture series is to advance the educational opportunities of the college, the community at large, and to re-engage with alumni, all of our alumni across the world. And in that vein, I'm pleased to continue to introduce our provost, Dr. Joe Lane, who will introduce our special guest today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Angie. It is truly an honor to introduce Professor Bruce Ledowitz, the Adrienne Van Kom Endowed Chair in Scholarly Excellence and Professor of Law at Duquesne University Law School, as our Larry Grimes lecturer today. Making this introduction is also a relief, albeit a cautious sense of relief. You see, I first asked Professor Ledowitz to speak at a convocation hour at Bethany quite a while back, and we did plan for him to do so. It was all set up for March 25th, 2020. More than 18 months ago, and that engagement did not quite work out. As I remember, something popped up. And even now, we gather outside under a tent rather than inside in the academic parlor. Even now, many of our audience, maybe most of our audience, are on the other end of a screen rather than here on campus, though it is a beautiful day under the tent. If you're watching in your office on your computer, please come out here. It's really nice. But if there's some silver linings in this terrible pandemic disruption, one must be that we have learned to be together in dialogue even when we cannot be together in space. And that is an appropriate note to sound, because Professor Ledowitz has made a career in calling us into dialogue. His work as a teacher, a scholar, an activist, a thinker, a public intellectual, a blogger, a podcaster, is about guiding us into deep thought and respectful dialogue on the most divisive and vexing issues in American public life: the relative claims of religion and secularism, the death penalty, abortion, the implications of partisanship in our shared civic space. These are tough issues, and our speaker has devoted his career to helping us confront them in ways that do not rely on self-pious certainties, partisan acrimony, and ad hominem attacks. A graduate of Georgetown University and Yale Law School, Professor Ledowitz has served on the faculty at Duquesne since 1980. He has served as co-director of the Duquesne University School of Law's Pennsylvania Constitution website. He founded the Allegheny Death Penalty Project, which he directed for 13 years. He co-founded the Western Pennsylvania Coalition Against the Death Penalty and served from 1985 to 1990 as secretary of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. He is a past winner of the Allegheny County Bar Association's Pro Bono Service Award, the Pennsylvania Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers Liberty Award, and the Marjorie Manson Civil Liberties Award. He was named the inaugural Dr. John and Liz Murray Award for Excellence in Faculty Scholarship in 2012, and he became the first member to win the award a second time in 2017. Professor Ledowitz has authored 4 influential books, including American Religious Democracy in 2007, Hallowed Secularism in 2009, Church, State, and the Crisis in American Secularism in 2011, and the very soon to be released, in many ways debuted today, The Universe is on Our Side, which will be released from Oxford University Press in just 2 weeks. Professor Ledowitz's work is particularly salient as we learn to live into a post-January 6, 2021 political reality that is increasingly fractured by a toxic sectarianism in which partisans speak in violent terms, devoid of any sense of the humility one might expect of those who live in awe of the divine. These lectures were inaugurated as a way of discussing difficult issues just like these. These are the types of questions that animated the work of Dr. Larry Grimes. And although he could not join us physically today and is watching through YouTube, we know that Dr. Grimes is committed in all his work to helping us think through the tough questions we face as individuals and as a nation. We hope this one is right up his alley. Please join me in welcoming our 2021 Larry Grimes lecturer, Professor Bruce Ledowitz.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. Thank you, President Rodenberg, the Alumni Council, the staff here at Bethany College, for the opportunity to deliver the Larry Grimes Lecture this year. It is a great honor. Stephen Smith noticed the ontological problem before I did. In 2004, in a prescient book entitled Law's Quandary, Smith pointed out that there was an ontological gap between what lawyers hold to be real as part of the culture and what lawyers profess as lawyers. As participants in the culture, lawyers are materialists, considering only matter and forces to be real. But in legal discourse, lawyers treat non-material values, such as justice, as real. According to Smith, the willingness to do this in law, to engage in normative realism, is what makes the rule of law possible. Smith called this divergence between law and the culture the ontological gap. Smith thought that the divergence could just go on and doubted that lawyers were actually as materialistic as their general pronouncements might suggest. Smith was right about the ontological gap, but he had the matter backwards. It turned out that lawyers don't believe in justice, at least not anymore, indeed don't believe that values are real. The result was the breakdown of the rule of law and much else. Amidst the irrational wreckage of American public life, we can see that nihilism was a fundamental problem, and not just for lawyers. I do not know Professor Larry Grimes, for whom this lecture is named, personally, but I don't believe this turn of events would surprise him. When I was invited by Provost Lane to give this talk, he informed me that each year we have someone from a different academic background to speak to the ways in which the liberal arts have informed their view of the world and the work they do. In other words, this lecture is about the relationship between the liberal arts and everything else. What was revealed in Smith's misjudgment is that there is no distinction between the liberal arts and everything else. Decline in the liberal arts leads to decline generally. The crisis that America is experiencing lies in precisely the question that the liberal arts tradition historically addresses. What is ultimately the meaning of the human experience? America, the West, and I think large swaths of other world cultures no longer understand that question or how to practice the liberal arts. And that crisis can only be corrected by recourse to the liberal arts tradition in some form. In this crisis, we are all in the liberal arts. Thus, my forthcoming book, The Universe is on Our Side, which I assumed was about law and politics, was accepted for publication by Cynthia Reed, executive editor in the Oxford Religious section. The book was considered religious because of where I located the source of the breakdown. I came to see that the crisis in American law and public life in general was a result of a phenomenon that I had experienced in my own life, the death of God. In the early 2000s, having lost my belief in God, I left my ancestral Judaism, where I had been raised in orthodoxy, in an action that paralleled what was going on in the lives of millions of other Americans at the same time. This group, of which I was now a part, became known as the Nuns, because in answering the questions of religious affiliation on surveys, we answer none. Admittedly, I was older than most of the rest of that group and had been much more religious than most of them, but we were now all adrift without religion. Today, less than half of Americans report that they are associated with any religious institution, and only around a third of Americans respond that they attend religious activities once a week, and actual membership and attendance are undoubtedly much lower than that. Now, I have to be clear what I mean by the death of God. Most of the nuns do not call themselves atheists. Many say they believe in a higher power. And of course, millions of Americans remain fervent and sincere religious believers, including, I would guess, many members of this audience. But the death of God does not operate at the personal level. It operates at the level of the culture. The death of God is about the effectiveness and presence of God in the culture. As the philosopher Martin Heidegger described, Nietzsche's announcement of the death of God in 1882 was not about Nietzsche the atheist, but rather was a pronouncement that the ideal world, the good, the true, the beautiful, and the just, as well as God, could no longer found and sustain a civilization. Organized secularists, like the new atheists of the early 21st century, celebrate the death of God. But what they forget is that Nietzsche knew that the death of God was a cataclysmic event. It robbed the West, and America in particular, of its founding story. While it is arguable whether America was founded as a Christian nation, there is no question that it was founded by people who were enacting a theistic story, the story of a benevolent universe created by a caring deity and destined for a glorious future. The role of science in this story was to illustrate the beneficence of the creation. Bethany College was founded very much out of that coherent, inclusive, and universal story. Dr. Grimes once noted that Alexander Campbell, Bethany's founder, thought in Enlightenment terms that, quote, reason and religion could live together very nicely. Campbell wanted education that would allow people to be useful to themselves and to others, and thus to God. As Professor Grimes put it in the first inaugural lecture that Angie mentioned, the point of such an education is to learn, quote, how one might live a life that would give light rather than increase darkness, a life that would show mercy and seek justice rather than a life filled with noise and restlessness. That founding story is the story to which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was adverting when he said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, a statement that is practically America's foundational creed. Because America was never ethnic in its organization, but was founded on a series of creedal commitments, the loss of that founding story was much more dramatic in its impact here than in Europe. But Europe is now also experiencing the death of God in a breakdown of meaning similar to ours. When that founding story collapsed, no story emerged to take its place. Today we are materialists in part, believers in part, but either way, this is half-hearted. We are not genuinely committed to anything as a culture. That indecisiveness has affected everything. That indecisiveness is why Smith can refer to an ontological gap between what lawyers say in a professional context and what they believe or say in other contexts. The rule of law requires a commitment to truth, or at least the promise of eventual truth. If instead you suspect that everything is power and perspective, you cannot have a rule of law, and you need something else. The indecisiveness, that is the continuing presence of a no longer effective founding story of God, along with the reflexive story of materialism, means that lawyers continue to refer to the rule of law at the same time that they denigrate values as merely human constructs. As I described in a 2015 Law Review article, there was a 5-day period in 1992 when every single justice on the Supreme Court joined one of two opinions describing values in these relativistic terms. Yet every one of those justices would still have insisted on the importance of the rule of law and would not have noticed the inconsistency. My discipline of law refuses to take law's quandary seriously, but the quandary rears its head inevitably. So, when there were allegations that the presidential election had been stolen, judges announced that there was no evidence of any election fraud. but the media reported, because they knew the public would insist on it, which of these judges had been appointed by President Trump and which by a different president. The need for this public reassurance illustrates the absence of the rule of law. Naming presidents like that is nihilism in action. But the skepticism in that story is not just what ordinary people think. Lawyers think that way too. It may be remembered that in 2018, President Trump attacked a decision by a federal district judge as having been rendered by, quote, an Obama judge. That comment led to a rare rebuke by Chief Justice John Roberts, who went out of his way to say to the Associated Press, we do not have Obama judges or Trump judges, Bush judges or Clinton judges. What we have is an extraordinary group of dedicated judges doing their level best to do equal right to those appearing before them. That independent judiciary is something we should all be thankful for. As I pointed out at the time, however, the legal profession mostly agreed with Trump, not Roberts. That is why Republicans and Democrats are both in their own ways trying to pack the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. It's persons and not the law that we believe control legal outcomes. Our indecisiveness was at its most obvious in the National Day of Prayer, announced by President Trump for Sunday, March 15, 2020. The whole thing was a desultory rote exercise that passed almost without notice, a leftover note of our previous belief in God. But in addition to that, there was a glaring omission in the call to the Day of Prayer. This is not a criticism of President Trump. It would have been the same at this point under any president. Listen to the heart of the announcement of the call. In this time, we must not cease asking God for added wisdom, comfort, and strength, and we must especially pray for those who have suffered harm or who have lost loved ones. I ask you to join me in a day of prayer for all people who have been affected by the coronavirus pandemic and to pray for God's healing hand to be placed on the people of our nation. Now, at one time, Americans would have seriously prayed in the terms Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. God, please spare us the pandemic, but your will be done. That request to be spared was absent in the call. You cannot ask a non-believing culture to pray for a deity to affect a virus. We all know that is not how the universe works. Viruses must be countered through scientific methods. The call was a perfect reflection of the death of God, but without acknowledging that death. The indecisiveness also results in the unreality of American public life, in which serious questions are simply not addressed. We cannot resolve the fundamental questions of the meaning of our existence and cannot resolve anything else important either. I call this condition in the book the Age of Evasion, and I do not mean that as a political matter. Evasion is obviously present on the political right, in what Paul Krugman calls zombie ideas, like tax cuts pay for themselves, but it is present as well on the left, which, it should be remembered, was the originator of the anti-vaccine movement and often refuses to take biology seriously, whether in issues of gender or abortion. And of course, no one on either side of the aisle takes the national debt seriously. We act as if you can cut taxes and spend vociferously forever with no consequence. The Age of Evasion was being established as early as the 1970s and 1980s when Bruno Latour and others argued that scientific facts are not discovered in nature, but are produced by knowledge networks. If that is not unreality, I don't know what is. It is amusing to hear Latour now try to explain why this thinking is not responsible for climate change denial. The crisis affects the liberal arts as well as public life. It is present in the loss of confidence in literature over the possibility of a Western canon, even after correction for racism and sexism. It is present in the loss of narrative in history, no more big stories. It is present in the criticism of Western notions of science that are part of some purported anti-racism curricula. The great champion of liberal education, historian Donald Kagan, who passed away in August, observed that current liberal education is failing to provide students with a common set of values and the tools to make sense of the world. That is why, in the words of Mary Carr, the Catholic memorist, we live, quote, in an age when even to use the word truth, or even to say the word truth, it always comes now with finger squiggles around it, comes with quotes around it, as though to say, how dare one presume to know the truth? We still talk in terms of truth, but we don't believe it. The fact that Time magazine could, in 2017, ask on its cover, is truth dead, without setting off a wave of indignation or at least a serious response, shows how deep the hole is into which we have fallen. The loss of our founding story is the reason that Americans are divided, angry, and lost. It is the reason for deaths of despair. It is the reason for the irrationality of vaccine resistance and climate change denial. Americans have lost faith in a universe that makes sense, and that means that nothing can make sense. We don't even realize that this loss of faith is the reason for our troubles. That is why we are not doing anything about it. So, what is to be done? A call for a return to religion? That would be ridiculous in the present circumstance. A call for a robust commitment to materialism? That would be too abrupt. The culture has not at this point shed all aspects of the God habit. We still expect to be rescued from our own folly. For me, the most important contribution of my book is that instead of just lamenting, half the book is dedicated to trying to do something about our condition. I said at the start of this talk that we were all in the liberal arts. As Dr. Grimes also once noted, the purpose and methods of the liberal arts are not doctrinal, not matters of answers. The following is a paraphrase attributed to Professor Grimes. The purpose of the liberal arts is to liberate the minds of students, to help them get rid of prejudices and narrow-mindedness, to open them up to the world around them, and to make them into curious, lifelong learners. That is, the liberal arts proceed by questioning. And that is what I do in the book. I turn to a question. In the second half of the book, after tracing the breakdown, I announce that America can only return to health by asking a fundamental question. I know that this step will strike many people as odd, to have a book about the crisis. They say that means that what you're saying is true. Okay. I know that step will strike many people as odd, to have a book about the crisis in American public life suggests that asking a question is the way back to health. Surely people will think that the way back in our political polarization must involve denouncing somebody, or at least must involve some policy change to undermine big money or campus culture or some other conventional wisdom. But nothing of that kind is sufficiently fundamental to address the depth of the crisis we face, which is the spiritual crisis of secular culture. The steps to health have little to do with politics per se. The question I come to focus on is from the Canadian Jesuit theologian and philosopher Bernard Lonergan, who let the yes. The question I focus on comes from the Canadian Jesuit theologian and philosopher Bernard Lonergan. Well, we all needed a break. Dr. Lane asked the question earlier today. He said, why don't we always have our speeches out in the tent? Hallelujah. Why do I have the feeling that this is a direct response from heaven to the claim about the death of God? Right. I presume it's only 2 verses. It is beautiful. The question I focus on comes from the Canadian Jesuit theologian and philosopher Bernard Lonergan, well, I'm going to go on. Sorry, yes. Who in 1972 asked a question in the book Method in Theology that he thought every human being must ultimately answer. He asked, is the universe on our side? And he amplified, is the universe on our side, or are we just gamblers? And if we are gamblers, are we not perhaps fools, individually struggling for authenticity and collectively endeavoring to snatch progress from the ever-mounting welter of decline? Does there or does there not necessarily exist a transcendent, intelligent ground of the universe? Is the universe on our side? Now, admittedly, choosing one question in this context is a bit of a stunt. I don't mean that this is the only question that could be asked or the only question that would be helpful, but speaking as someone who lost faith in God later in life, I found that Lonergan's question, is the universe on our side, I found it to be secular, specific, and concrete in a way that is helpful. It is much better than other questions that could be asked, such as whether values are real and so forth. Lonergan's question helped me to formulate my current faith, and I say faith intentionally, because although the question has its empirical aspects, one's final judgment on the universe is more a matter of commitment than conclusion. It is not easy to ask a question like Lonergan's. For one thing, openness to an important question is always difficult. But for another, our default position of naturalism would seem to preclude the question at the start. How can atoms be on anybody's side? The book answers that by explaining the role of Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy in even allowing the possibility of a positive answer to Lonergan's question to emerge without supernaturalism. I won't go into all of that explanation here, except to say that Whitehead addresses the inadequacy of an epistemology of sensation and proposes real knowledge beyond sensory perception, thus validating experiences of and influences of ideal normative categories. With Whitehead, without employing supernaturalism of any sort, it is possible to refer to the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the just as part of the universe, and to understand beneficent purpose and aim as more than just human constructs. It is possible, in other words, to speak meaningfully of living in harmony with a deeper harmony in the ultimately real. But that does not answer Lonergan's question. Whitehead, just opens the question up for consideration. Asking Lonergan's question means really asking. That is, not just assuming an answer. To emphasize that Lonergan really meant it as a question, although he himself, of course, answered yes, I wanted the title of the book to be, Is the Universe on Our Side? But Cynthia Reed said she was not putting a question mark in the title of a book. And anyway, readers would want to know where I stand on the answer. Since I do take a stand, I have to be upfront about it. I answer the question, yes, but I do devote a whole chapter to the possibilities of a negative answer. I believe you can build a healthy civilization even if the answer to Lonergan's question turns out to be no, the universe is not on our side. In other words, I'm trying to convince people that America's problem is spiritual, that it roots in the death of God, and that it can be addressed by a considered and rigorous effort to ask Lonergan's question. But that is all the argument that I make. The book is not an argument about whether the universe is on our side. In the book, I just illustrate why people might feel one way or the other. For example, people might assume that the answer to Lonergan's question must be no, because we die, and everything will eventually pass away. In Sam Harris's memorable phrase, the universe sustains us, it would seem, only to devour us at its leisure. So it is obvious that, at the very least, the universe is not on our side. But that does not preclude healthy public life. The possibilities of the no are illustrated by Carl Sagan's magnificent gesture from 1990. On February 14, 1990, just 34 minutes before Voyager 1 powered off its cameras forever, a picture of the Earth was taken, 3.7 billion miles away from the sun. In the original Cosmos series, the viewer sees Earth fading to what Sagan calls the pale blue dot. And he says, our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. In Sagan's 1994 book, Pale Blue Dot, which was inspired by that photograph, he added this commentary. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Sagan's point with the pale blue dot photograph, depressing, it should be terrifying, but Sagan also hoped that it would be softening. That is, since we are alone, we should be kind to each other. Granted, the universe is just forces and matter, but life has evolved in tune with that. And so we really are at home here on Earth. From the perspective of the no, you would not have a national day of prayer, but you could have a national day of solidarity. That is the unexpected potential of the no to renew American public life. In the book, I take issue with the no, primarily over another part of Lonergan's question that asks whether the universe is like us. The no seems to assume that humanity is quite different from everything else in the universe, and I am skeptical about that. But as I say, I'm not trying to convince anyone to affirm the yes. Although I do answer yes, the universe is on our side. I stand there with Lonergan, Whitehead, and Dr. King. It is a faith, but I think it is reasonable. Now, what might cause someone to answer Lonergan's question yes, despite the reality of death? I conclude in the book that death and destruction are absolutely necessary for human beings to be our best. Death is not a conclusive reason for answering no. What about positive evidence for the yes? Is there reason to believe that the universe is on our side? The cosmological theologian Tom Berry calls these reasons moments of grace. These are moments of great cosmological or religious and historical transformation. These moments in the story of the universe that we know and the parts of that story that most concern us are numerous. The beginning of the universe, the supernova that collapsed and thus provided the materials for our solar system, the Earth in its life-sustaining orbit, the emergence of life, the beginning of photosynthesis, the awakening of human intelligence, and on and on. All of these moments, individually unpredictable and unexpected, form a beneficent pattern for humanity. In the language of theology, but appealing to the same cosmic power of the new, the theologian Karl Barth wrote, "The truly creative act by which men become the children of Abraham, by which stones are transformed into sons, does not lie in the possible possibility of the law, but in the impossible possibility of faith." That is, everything important that we rely on would once have seemed impossible. Science has a term for this creativity: emergence. Emergence can mean simply that an entity has traits that its separate components do not. Thus, emergence is a quality of most complex systems. In evolutionary theory, emergence includes the sense of the unpredictable and the unanticipated. Life on Earth is a series of such emergences, from life itself to the living cell to sexual reproduction to sentience to cognition. As Brian Swimme asks in the Journey of the Universe documentary, what is the creativity that could bring forth all this? We human beings are an example of this cosmic creativity, both in our own emergence and in the creativity which we in turn are capable. And the universe is not just creativity. Its creativity moves in a certain direction, which we can call the telos, or destiny of the universe. That is further evidence of the yes. There is the directionality of evolution, for example, which was accepted by Whitehead. In the fable Ishmael, Daniel Quinn has a student endorse this directionality. The student says, there's a sort of tendency in evolution, wouldn't you say? If you start with those ultra-simple critters in the ancient seas and move up step by step to everything that we see now and beyond, then you have to observe a tendency toward complexity and toward self-awareness and intelligence. Another form of the telos of the universe is revealed in the debate over whether the emergence of life is built into the nature of matter and its tendency of self-organization. It had been assumed by orthodox Darwinian thought that the emergence of life was an unlikely and contingent event, and this was Sagan's, at least unconscious, assumption in the Pale Blue Dot monologue. However, there is a growing view that matter's self-organizing tendency, when combined with energy and the proper conditions, will generally produce life. In The Origin and Nature of Life on Earth, Eric Smith and Harold Morowitz are suitably subdued and careful in their pronouncement. Perhaps they chafe at the popular idea of life arising inevitably, but they do say, as the extent, complexity, and structure of geodynamics become a part of the frame through which we understand the living state, it becomes much more difficult to see life as a singularity, and more seemingly inevitable that it is an elaboration within an ongoing process of planetary maturation. We can conclude at the very least that life arises naturally. And if life does arise, the biologist Simon Conway Morris has argued for years that the human evolutionary path would basically be followed. There is nothing unique about the way humans evolved on Earth. This life-friendly universe is entirely natural, and that is the point. The universe can be viewed as on the side of the emergence of beings like us. I know I am double counting in a sense. First, I say something like life is so unexpected that the creativity involved shows the universe is on our side. Then I say life is so naturally built in that its regularity shows the universe is on our side. But isn't the fact that life naturally arises in the universe exactly what would be unexpected? So it is both. The telos of the universe is not just revealed in physical properties like complexity or even mental properties like self-awareness. In Primates and Philosophers, Franz de Waal traces the evolution of morality. We come from a long line of animals that gradually developed capacities for empathy and sympathy. As Brian Swimme puts it in The Journey of the Universe, we are descendants of a fish that, contrary to the practice of other fish, did not eat her young. All of this is suggestive in its individual parts, but when you put it all together, you end up with a universe that favors life, complexity, intelligence, and morality. That sounds like a universe that is on our side. There is also direct evidence that the universe is on our side. For one thing, its laws favor us. In one sense, this is obviously so. The laws of science are good for us. We need oxygen. The planet produces oxygen in abundance. We need food. The planet produces food. Just about everything on Earth is good for humans, which is why we are here. But the laws of the universe favor us in another and surprising way. They appear to be stable and universal. That stability and universality are such important evidence of a universe on our side that John Gray, who endorses the no, argues against both stability and universality in his book, 7 Types of Atheism. This is what he says. It is asserted that science is the exercise of discovering the universal laws of nature. But unless you believe that the human mind mirrors a rational cosmos, science can only be a tool the human animal has invented to deal with a world it cannot fully understand. The order that appears to prevail in our corner of the universe may be local and ephemeral, emerging randomly and then melting away. The very idea that we live in a law-governed cosmos may not be much more than a fading legacy of faith in a divine lawgiver. You have to admire Gray's unflinching honesty and consistency. But Gray's observations just show that if the universe is rational, and if we can come to understand the universe in part anyway, and if our minds do mirror the universe, and if its laws are stable and universal, then these conclusions by themselves are persuasive that the universe is on our side. Gray came to his contrary conclusions not by observation, but by pre-commitment. There is no reason to believe that he is right about any of his presuppositions. There is yet one more, even stranger sense of the universe is on our side. All these horrible events that occurred before the advent of civilization, such as an asteroid strike, have not happened since. Granted, the size is small. There have only been at most 10,000 or 15,000 years of human organized society. And even if we go back to the emergence of our strain of energetic apes, even 1 million years ago is not very long, there could be an asteroid or other terrible event around the corner. Yet, it has not happened. Furthermore, there is also the fact that although solar radiation reaching the Earth has substantially increased over the past 4 billion years by around 25%, the Earth's temperature has remained mostly stable and within a favorable range for life. The mechanism through which this has occurred, the reduction of carbon in the atmosphere, is clear, but not why it happened. Lewis Owen and Kevin Pickery explain this result as what they call the Gaia Hypothesis. The Earth's organisms collectively have an innate ability to self-regulate the external environmental conditions necessary to support and sustain life. I'm not sure that calling this the Gaia Hypothesis accomplishes anything besides pointing out that it happened. You could just as well say that the universe is on our side. The universe on our side is not just a passive description. Humans are participants in the beneficent actions of the universe. Conway Morris has a lovely phrase for this participation. His book, The Runes of Evolution, has this subtitle: How the Universe Became Self-Aware. Of course, we, in our imaginations, are a preeminent aspect of the self-awareness of the universe. We share what Morris calls cognitive architecture with other animals, but our way of understanding is unique. We appreciate the deep beauty of the universe in a way that other animals do not seem to. This may be our most significant participation in the universe. In an episode in the original Cosmos series, Carl Sagan not only pointed to our participation in this way, but rooted it in our biological and physical oneness with everything else, the carbon of which we are composed. He wrote, "We are a way for the universe to know itself. Some part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return, and we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff." Quantum mechanics is probably the best known and strangest example of human interaction with the universe. It appears that human observation of a particle collapses its wave function and fixes its position. In fact, as Bob Henderson observed in a New York Times article about a major controversy in quantum theory, because particles only behave like particles when we observe them, it isn't clear that the word particle is apropos of the unobserved world. On one level, the controversy in the article is over the role of human observation. The physicist Angelo Bassi is conducting experiments attempting to demonstrate that there are physical laws behind the observations of quantum theory that can be stated without reference to human action. But on another level, the controversy is over whether the physical universe is really knowable and whether physics is about knowledge or simply prediction. Certainly, if it turns out that the universe is fundamentally unknowable, Bernard Lonergan's view of its intelligibility will suffer and John Gray's position will be strengthened. But we don't know this yet. At the moment, even the strange world of quantum physics, in which again in the words of Henderson, it appears that we humans are conjuring the reality we experience out of a murky netherworld that quantum mechanics implies is unknowable, is itself a reminder of how connected with everything else we really are. On the other hand, if it turns out that the universe is something that we can know, it will be Lonergan's ultimate vindication. He felt that the immanent source of transcendence in man is his detached, disinterested, unrestricted desire to know. If that is the case, we and the universe are fundamentally the same kind of thing, which is another way of saying that the universe is on our side. And if any further evidence is needed that the universe is on our side, it turns out to be actually true, or so it seems to me, that history bends toward justice. How does the yes help us? The implication of the yes for public life is that there are discoverable, objective, normative standards in the universe, that it is not nonsense to talk about goodness, truth, beauty, and justice in universal terms, despite important and enduring cultural differences. It means, in my own discipline of law, that I can once again embrace my teacher, Charles Black's vision of law as the art of doing justice. I don't have to bow before relativism and skepticism, and I don't have to conclude that all invocations of justice are just disguised power plays on behalf of privilege in one form or another. And there are similar implications for the other disciplines. Such a universe would provide the common set of values that Professor Kagan wanted liberal education to promote. In science, it means that the late Steven Weinberg's meaningless universe is not the last word. The yes also implies that there is a significant possibility, even likelihood, that reasoned discourse will ultimately lead to consensus, that today's opponent will be tomorrow's ally, because there are right, or at least righter, answers to policy questions. It is not all just a matter of opinion and power. I don't mean that all this is easy. At an earlier time, a time that people assumed there were right and wrong answers to moral questions, we still had to fight a civil war to abolish slavery. But the yes is much more hopeful than our current fatalistic assumption that my opponent is beyond persuasion. All this comes from asking a question: is the universe on our side? That we can easily imagine ourselves asking individually. But Lonergan meant more than just an individual asking this question. You have to remember that the story of the Creator God founded a civilization. The institutions and concepts of that civilization, what we loosely call the West, took the starting point of God for granted. So, for example, our commitment to individualism, which celebrates human choice and agency, would make no sense if we ourselves were just matter in motion. The culture came to a consensus on these issues. Western civilization grew. And that kind of cultural consensus must happen again, and it will. If we ask Lonergan's question seriously, we will come to a consensus. But exactly how does a culture ask a question? I will leave you today with Lonergan's judgment about that, because it is uniquely relevant to a community like Bethany College. Lonergan thought that in periods of decline, which he thought were inevitable, a society would be aided by a loose social formation he called cosmopolis. Cosmopolis isn't a bounded group. It doesn't have a policy program. It's not a political party. It consists of those persons who are engaged in open questioning and dialogue in the culture. This may happen in the arts or philosophy or the media. Cosmopolis could be anyone doing anything, but in a certain way. It is through such persons that society asks a question. And that means that our society must create institutions and settings in which such open questioning can happen without any artificial restriction. These settings don't have to be formal, but it strikes me that a community like Bethany College can be a part of Cosmopolis. Here, you can ask the question, is the universe on our side, directly and continuously, as a community within, in the classroom, and as a witness for the larger society outside the classroom. In other words, I believe the renewal of American life can begin right here in this place, right now, and I hope that it will. Thank you.
I would start, if you would allow me. So, when you look at, one of the things I think is really intriguing when you think about the breakdown of the faith in American society is nevertheless that eschatology seems like kind of in-days type of reasoning, even without God, seems to hold on very well, right? People want to think there's some great cosmic struggle and they're on the side, but maybe not in very healthy ways. And you see that as a type of grasping for meaning, and is it something that we should treat with some respect as a way of trying to ask valuable questions, or is it actually a way of shutting down those questions and making life reinforcing our nihilism in its unreality? I don't know.
Well, in the book, I talk about was a New York Times article in the middle of the pandemic in the summer of 2020, and the point of the article was everyone is saying that things are at an end. And in that context, it was a way of shutting down questioning. It was a way of expressing a kind of fatalism that nothing is to be done. So what you get with the death of God is the decline of really good religion, but it leaves the residue of all the worst parts of religion, and the certainty, the idea that I'm on God's side, all that sort of thing, which healthy religion questions. Religion in decline doesn't have the resources to question. So we end up in a way with the worst of all worlds. Yes?
Thank you. Lots going on, and I guess I have a lot of questions I'll be living with. I guess that's kind of the point.
Well, as a matter of fact, it isn't hard to find me, and I'm not one of these authors who has a page and then you put in your question and never hear from them. I don't have that many readers, so it's pretty clear that if you send a question, I'll get it and respond.
Well, I was thinking the fruit of a good lecture is it lives with you for a while, and so that's good. Maybe one of the questions in my mind is, do you distinguish between deism and theism?
No, right.
In your assertion, because I think that's maybe some clarity around that
It's a very good question. I stay away from it. This is a popular book, I hope, and to do justice to that distinction would have required a kind of depth that the book does not have, and is not meant to have. But deism has been understood by some as, I think, may have been one step on the road to the death of God. It was sort of a halfway house for those people who thought in the founding of the Constitution generation that God was no longer active. I think that was just one step on the way to the death of God.
It's a foundational point.
Right. Yeah, it starts everything in motion, and then God passes away.
So a lot of the folks who are still confessing are not deists.
Well, I don't. I have to say that I say that there are many, many, many atheists, more atheists than we think, and some of them go to church every week. I don't think much. I'd run into real believers, but I will tell you a quick story. I had to leave my synagogue, Dor Hadash, which you may have remembered was one of the synagogues was the subject of the shooting in 2018. And I left when I lost my faith in God. And they invited me back to give a talk, because I still support the wonderful work of that synagogue. And I gave a talk about this, and afterwards my friends came up to the bima and they said, well, I don't understand why you had to leave. I don't believe in God. Now, conversely, I was then cornered by one of the Chassidim, one of my members of my own group when I was growing up, in the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh. And he walked up to me, as they do, and tried to get fallen away Jews to do something more and reconnect. And so he said, are you Jewish? And I said, well, I used to be. And he said, I've never heard that answer before. And I told him my story, and to him it made sense that you leave Judaism if you don't believe in God, because he still understood Judaism as an ongoing relationship with the Holy One, blessed be he. I don't know how much of that kind of religion we've actually got in our churches, synagogues, and mosques, and other houses of worship. Well, I don't want to hold everybody, but I just want to thank you again for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you to those who were able to join via stream. We hope you will be able to be on campus next year for the next Brian's lecture, and we will think about the